feel like the first thing to say is that this title is somewhat misleading in that to a certain extent, you can't really heal emotional trauma. I mean, you can and you can't, in that your origin story is your origin story is your origin story, and it never ever disappears completely. And I want to be really honest about that because I think it's quite a common trap in the process of healing to think that at some point, if you have had a rough start to life, that you might move through the world like a securely attached, mentally stable person. And you might, but that won't always be the whole picture. There'll be other stuff that goes on internally. But with Bufo, we're able to move beyond that and create enough space to see the self that existed even before we have memories of what it was like to exist without that trauma and that fear and the nervous system dysregulation. And so we get a new baseline, a new frame of reference to aspire towards. And it's like a muscle. The more that we practice the new ways of being, the easier it becomes, the more natural it starts to feel. But there's no shortcuts, unfortunately. You have to do the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we do the work, it's building a new relationship with the trauma and being able to live differently, more empowered. And so I think it'll be helpful to just start with what trauma is. Um, And so from my understanding, it's an experience or an event that happens to us or something we experience or witness that is overwhelming for our nervous system to cope. And when we're talking about childhood traumas, are, from the moment we're born, there's a developmental mechanism. But if that experience or event is overwhelming, our brain switches to survival, our psyche goes into survival, which then impacts us possibly a lifetime. And whenever I'm talking about trauma, I always make a point to talk about there's trauma with a capital T, but there's also trauma with a little t, which might sometimes not feel as impactful, but it's just as overwhelming for a child. And so, abuse is one form. Grief could be witnessing violence, it could be poverty, it could be war, this developmental trauma if your primary caregiver was neglecting or over demanding, like so many forms of big T trauma. At the same time, there's little t trauma, which, if we get the chance, I'd love to share a couple of those experiences and how working with the medicine has completely changed that relationship for me.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Please do, Mo. I often think with the little t trauma, it can be really insidious because the big grave things that happen are so shocking, and our mind understands intellectually this was a trauma because of the scale of it. Whereas the little t trauma, they are so insidious in the way that we don't necessarily label them as trauma, but they leave their imprint. And so we live continuing to project that onto the rest of our lives. And we never look at it or address it because it's buried and it's unconscious. Yeah, please do share some examples from
Yeah,
your life.
and I only became aware of it since working with plant medicine. That's how, and so I've been living with this for over 30 years. And one of the things we talk about in our training is emotional alchemy, emotional processing. And I was so cut off from my emotions unless they were real extremes. And we say that when we work with the medicine, our emotions could be heightened, not only in the ceremony experience, but in day-to-day life. And if we don't build that capacity to hold the emotion, we bury it, we push it away, and when it gets stuck in some form. So I'm doing this work, like really paying attention to my emotions, and then psychedelics open me up. And then I'm starting to feel anxiety when someone's about to be late for their meeting. I'm like, why am I feeling this? It's got nothing to do with me. But then a memory triggered. I was primary school, probably year 4 or 3. So I don't know, 7, 8, and I was late one day to school, no fault of my own. My mum was ill and she took me to the corridor, and I said, no, you go home. I will go in. At the moment I walk in, the teacher scolds me like I've never been scolded in my life. And this memory returns to me as an adult in my 40s where I could feel the kid like shaking. And then all the pieces just made sense. Me, I'd always get anxious about turning up to appointments on time. You've known me now for how many years? I'm always on time. And it takes something extreme for me to be late. And so many arguments I've had with friends, family. Why are you ready? Why aren't you ready? We're going to be late. And it all stems back to this moment where this kid was overwhelmed. I remember the shaking, the heart racing, like pounding. And so that was unconsciously playing in my life and affecting me, where if I have an appointment at 7 o'clock, I'd show up at 6:30 and I have half an hour to kill, not knowing what to do. Um, and like the number of arguments I've had with people about timekeeping, and all of a sudden I can now return to that kid and give him so much love and compassion. And the medicine tests you. And I've been late since, like, pretty much immediately that day I had an opportunity to be late, and I was able to build a relationship differently. I'm on the train and I'm like, who's going to tell me off now? So that's one small t trauma. And how many of those are out there in the field where we just go about our lives unconsciously? But now if I put that on a piece of paper compared to my big T trauma, like my dad dying at the age of 2, that's huge. Equally affected me in other ways, but for a child, both shook the system, both took me into overwhelm, and then ends up affecting me for a lifetime.
Mm, yeah, and I think you gave the example of your dad dying when you were 2, and these particular traumas, like the things that happen in that period where we barely have a memory of that time in our life. A lot of our what we think is our memory is like retelling of events to us years later, and so there's trauma that we have from a difficult birth. There's trauma
Yes,
from when we were in the womb. There's ancestral trauma. All of this stuff happens pre-verbal, a lot of it pre-cognitive too. And so when we try to access it and work with it using conventional modalities like talking therapy, we are rooting around for something that we don't have access to. And so that's where psychedelics can be really helpful in getting into that pre-verbal, pre-cognitive space. And similarly with the trauma that we experience later in life, it is challenging, of course, challenging, but if we've had period of relatively positive existence with good mental health, we have a baseline of what it is like to feel happy, to feel safe, to feel secure, to feel at peace. And so when we're working with later in life trauma, we have that thing that our body remembers what it felt like before the trauma existed. Whereas childhood trauma is particularly tricky because a lot of the time we're trying to work back to a baseline that we have no actual memory of, and that's something that Bufo was so helpful for me. Like I grew up in a really disturbing, distressing, chaotic household, and my unconscious would just throughout my life seek out situations that replicated that dysfunctional dynamic. And in my Bufo journey, like just feeling what it was like for the first time to be completely at peace, and
Mm,
it completely changed the way that I lived my life. And it wasn't like, oh, and I never wanted to was never drawn towards a dysfunctional situation again. Like, of course, the unconscious is always seeking out what's familiar, but with that new frame of reference, for that new baseline, it was like, okay, I can choose different. And it's still me having to do that work of choosing differently and choosing to react differently or not react. But it gave me that gift. And similarly, the relationship that we form with our, primarily with our mother, but also with our parents in general, is like the basis through which we form ideas and perceptions about the world, because these are the people who give us life. And so from that place we label them as like kind, loving, benevolent, generous, and those are the positives that we might then project onto our reality. Or we label them as neglectful, abusive, unkind, disrespectful, and those become our worldviews that we project onto everything and onto God, the divine, that we believe like this is how my life is going to go and this is the way that people are. And you feel like your whole body just expand with this feeling of safety and love, and feeling like you actually get direct access to that divine love. Is just so soothing for people who didn't have that experience in childhood. And like you said, a lot of people, it's not just the big T trauma, it's the small ways in which we felt neglected or felt that our needs weren't met that can benefit from this medicine as well.
yeah, as you're sharing that sense of peace that you felt, I talk about the transcendental realm, and that's the realm that Bufo takes us. And from a depth psychology lens, there's healing on a somatic level, there's healing on a symbolic level, and there's healing on shamanic levels. And psychedelics is a cross section of all of them at different points in the journey. And when it comes to that transcendental realm, it's it's another layer where we can witness ourselves without the narrative, without that ego. Especially in Bufo, we talk about the ego dissolution. We have something called the default mode network that's filtering our reality here. Yet in those transcendental spaces, that quietens. We can, what happens when we let go of the evil? The evil? The ego. When we let go of the ego, what remains is the soul. We get a feeling of connection to something bigger than us, that divine and healing. There are no ways to explain how that happens. And there's research being carried out. As John Hopkins did research with psilocybin trials, where people who have the most mystical experiences go on to show longer term benefit when it comes to depression and anxiety, and that's those mystical experiences is that transcendental space. And it's not about dosage or how much of the medicine you take, it's about being able to get into those spaces and surrendering, and Bufo is a beautiful way to get that feeling that we can hold on to day to day.
Yeah, I love that. I love that because it's the witnessing ourselves beyond the trauma that creates this objectivity that means then when you return to your normal day-to-day life, you are able to, when those patterns come to the fore and you are starting to behave from the old script, and it will happen, but there's another place that you can go to observe that part of you that's being reacting from the old space, and you can stop yourself and say, okay. And it's not easy. There's so much work that goes around the capacity that we have to build with our own nervous system regulation to choose differently, but there is that, what it's like to be living from a space free of that trauma, that makes that possible. And it is a really life changing thing. I want to talk a little bit about integration as well, because I think this is where people grossly underestimate how challenging this is, because it's one thing to understand it when you're up in the realm, to understand it conceptually, to yes, I see, oh, I can see I've been doing this, I need to not be doing this. But like, boy, when you're dysregulated, and your nervous system is like screaming at you, like you're in danger, get the hell out of this situation, it is the tools, the capacity that you've built around the experience that allow you to choose differently. And that's not something that happens in the floating in the heavens.
No, we say how how you do anything is how you do everything, and life is one whole ceremony. And so with the retreat, we have a container, and on the other side of the container, the intention is for each person to have their daily container with the practices we teach. So many tools, so many processes, and having that daily practice is a container in itself. So we have a container for the retreat, but to integrate fully, it's up to us as individuals to have a container for ourselves. And we work with nature, we work with creativity, we work with emotions, the shadow, dreams, like so many different practices. And it's like a toolkit. You can pick which ones feel right for you for the short term, which ones might change over time. But that integration, will go back to the beginning, is that creating a new relationship for those imprints, for those scripts, knowing, yes, life was hard and challenging and extreme for some of us. Yeah, on the other side, where we are now, we can choose differently, as you say, with the help of these
Mm,
tools.
mm. One other thing I wanted to mention was, you don't need to know what happened
Mm.
necessarily. And I think that's a really beautiful thing as well. Look at what's happening now in the present day sense, the patterns that are repeating, the cycles that you feel like you can't break free from. And that's where the intention comes from, by going the way in which your life is affected in the present day, and then you can surrender it to the medicine. Because
Yeah.
if this stuff is coming from a previous lifetime, or when you were 1 or 6 months or in utero, you can waste a lot of mental energy trying to understand the why this thing happened, what exactly happened, and how does that link to your present day reality, when the beautiful thing about this medicine is that it can just wipe the slate clean for you.
So happy you shared that, because this process of us having a conversation around our Bufo experiences for the past few weeks has been so empowering, where I'm revisiting my own experiences. And I always say how Steve Jobs used to, or said once, you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect the dots looking back. And I've been looking back how my life was post Bufo. For me to even fly out to Bali, I was scared. Like, could I handle this long haul flight? It coming out of Bali, I didn't even think of it. A few weeks later, I'm like, yeah, I'll come to the jungle and spend a month there without internet, without Wi-Fi. Like, did that really happen? Because going to Bali was a huge, there was so much fear around that journey there. But for a month in in the jungle to do 10 ceremonies of ayahuasca, it was like, okay, let's do this. And all the other things that have happened since, it's yeah, would I have been able to get that from the moment I had the Bufo experience? I wouldn't have known. But looking back a year, 2 years, 3 years, the footprints are there.
Yeah, wow. What a journey.
Incredible.
Okay, Mo, let's leave it there. Next week, we're going to talk about death, preparing oneself for death. Not that we are preparing ourselves for death, but conceptually, psychologically, through the process of ego and dissolution.
Yeah, let's talk about it.